tips. Good.
Programming drums is an art form in itself, especially if you're trying to program them to sound realistic. I've been programming drums for quite a while now. There was a point where I was working with real drummers, and I believe that's actually something that's helped me with my drum programming. So in this video, I want to go over probably my top 5 tips on how to make your drums sound more realistic. Tip number 1, pick a sample library with a good amount of round robins. Now, what is a round robin? Spitfire has a quick little article here. Round robins allow you to play the same note repetitively and trigger different recordings of the same note. So pretty much, if you're hitting the same velocity over and over again, it's going to trigger different audio files. That way it doesn't sound super robotic. And we want a drum library with good round robins. So if there's a part where we want consistent hits and we don't want it to sound stiff and robotic, we have those different samples being played so it doesn't sound like a robotic one shot. Now, as far as reputable brands that have, drum libraries with good round robins, I can't really vouch for a ton. I can only vouch for GGD. Their newer stuff, they have a good amount of round robins in their sample libraries. A lot of people like Superior Drummer, Steven Slate drums. They're pretty popular. I've never touched them. Those are supposed to be good. But really, you just want to pick any sample library that's going to have a decent amount of round robins from a reputable company. That way, when we get to those consistent parts, it doesn't sound like you're just firing off the same drum hit over and over again, getting that kind of robotic sound. Tip number 2, humanize the timing. This is talked about very lightly, but when you're recording real drums, especially when 2 drums are being hit at the same time, they're not always hit at the same time. Usually there's like a little bit of offset, whether it's the kick and the snare being hit at the same time or 2 toms being hit at the same time. Usually one is getting hit before the other. Now, sometimes it's very subtle and it's not even audible. Other times it's pretty audible if you really listen to it. And it's especially noticeable when there's those fast double kick parts and the snare is hitting. You'll hear almost like this flam effect if the drums were actually recorded and just not programmed. There's this flam effect, and it sounds pretty cool actually, as long as you don't overdo it. So yes, we want to randomize the timing. 12 milliseconds is a pretty good starting point, but we actually want to go in and make sure that you're offsetting some of these drum hits so we do get those flams. You don't need to go crazy. We just want to make sure we have some of that in our drum programming. All right, so I've got some drums here that I programmed. I messed around with the velocities, but I have not touched the timing. These are perfectly in time. Let's take a listen. This section I care about the most. So it's pretty stiff. It is on point. It works, but if we're going for realism, what we want to do is we want to go wherever in your DAW you have the Humanize tools. We're going to randomize by 12 milliseconds. We want random. Depending on your DAW, you could do early, late, or whatever. I'm going to click on random. We're not going to touch the velocities. Click OK. And if we look, we've got some nice little offsets going on here. This might do the trick. Let's take a listen. Okay, that pretty much did it. Sometimes you don't always get this lucky, and most of the hits look like this, where they're pretty much on time. And what you could do in here, make sure the snap is off. Don't have it on, snapping to any notes. And we're just gonna slide one of the notes just a little bit off, just so we get that little offset, that little flam. And how extreme you want this, it's up to you. If you want it more subtle, just randomizing by 12 milliseconds is going to do the job. If you really want to go for a more realistic sound, then I would go in after making the randomization and kind of nudging these notes here and there to get more of those flams. Tip number 3, don't set all your velocities to 127. I feel like this is a very obvious one. I feel like everyone talks about this a lot, but we don't want to do that. We want to make sure we're setting the velocities appropriately. So good snare, good solid snare hits, 120 should do the job. We obviously want a little bit of randomness. For me though, when it comes to the snare at the choruses, I keep it pretty consistent. I do rely heavily on that round robin though. So I could do the same hit over and over again at that velocity and it doesn't sound too robotic. I just want to make sure it cuts through the mix. Now your kick, that you want some randomness to it, nothing crazy. Your cymbals, there's like it's almost kind of like a flow to it where yes, they're pretty consistent, but sometimes hits are quieter than others, and you want to make sure that's in there. Snare rolls 127, that's going to sound like garbage. Go pretty low. Try at a velocity of 50, see where things go. Every sample library is going to be a little bit different, but you want to make sure that you're actually adjusting the velocities to fit each part. When you're going for like a faster double kick spot, the velocity is going to be a little bit quieter compared to those big heavy hits during the chorus. So let's take a look at this section where I have the velocities set appropriately. This is the snare roll section, and we're averaging about 70 for the velocities on the snare. Kicks are around 100, as you can see here. There's variance in them, and in the context of this section, you'll understand why. So we got some nice snare hits, nice variety. They're at the right level. And you can see we've got some accents down here which really help the part. So let's put this all to 175 and just show you how awful of an idea that would be. Yeah, I think you get the point. So we're gonna not do that. So we're going back to a part that I already went over before, but I just want you to see where like the kick velocities are. As you can see, we're at a little double bass part. And if we compare it to the harder hitting kicks before this, we got it just a little bit quieter. Now, we could go a little bit more extreme on this, depending on what you're going for. Like that works too. You don't want to like do this shit. You don't want to go like this. See how like artificially loud and consistent that is? We don't want that. And real quick, let's look at some cymbals over here. The velocities, they're like at about like 100, 110. You can see there's a little ebb and flow, like I was saying. You take a look. They're pretty consistent, but we've got some movement to them. Tip number 4, you want to be intentional with your double bass programming. Because with the double bass, the biggest thing that you want to do is make sure every other hit is quieter than the other, because a drummer is going to have a dominant foot and then a less dominant foot. So that less dominant foot is almost always going to have quieter hits. It doesn't have to be, drastic, but that left foot or that less dominant foot, whatever it is, the hits are going to be a little bit quieter. So when you're programming your double kick parts, kind of what I was saying before, with programming the velocities on the double kick, you want the velocities to be a little bit quieter than your big heavy hitting chorus kicks, but you also want those quieter, less dominant kicks in there. And to top it off, you can add some randomization to that double kick, and then it's just going to sound that much more realistic. It's going to sound a lot better than, say, just lowering the velocities. Having that inconsistency between the kicks makes it sound that much more realistic. And the randomization kind of just like melds it really well together. All right, so let me show you what I'm talking about. So we have this little double kick section that I have right here, and everything's at 127. So as you can hear, it sounds okay because we have those round robins, so it already does sound okay. But we're at 127, so that's too loud, and the kicks are just way too consistent. That's just not how double kick is played and sounds. So I already highlighted the areas that I want to lower. We're gonna go -13 on the velocity, so that's pretty good. And we're actually gonna lower, we're gonna want to bring those heavy hits down a bit. So let's hear how that sounds already. That sounds good. Technically, you could leave it there. A little bonus tip, I've noticed some drummers on the initial hit of the kick, it's accented. So I'm just gonna go to these areas, boost it up just a little bit, roughly 5. It doesn't matter where necessarily, it just needs to be a little bit louder than the rest. it's something I just noticed, and you know, it's a nice little touch that you can add to really get that realistic feel to your drums. So this is all a little tedious, but if realism is the goal, I think it's totally worth it. So almost done. If I could actually click this. All right, and there we go. I'm gonna lower this just a smidge. Nice, that sounds good. So these like single kicks right here, these would be hit a little bit harder. Awesome, and then to really seal the deal, we're gonna humanize. I'm gonna randomize by 10% the velocities. We're not touching the timing. I'm just focusing on the velocities for this. Bada bing, bada boom. That looks good. And that's probably the best way you could do double kick sections and make it sound realistic. Tip number 5 would be to not overdo it. I've done this before. When you overdo it, even if it's, you know, possible for a real drummer to do it, sometimes when you do drastic shifts in, you know, velocities, particularly, there's almost going to be this disconnect. I don't know if because there's no cymbal bleed or drum bleed in the mics. When you go from, say, like a 120 hit snare hit to like an 80 hit, you know, on the chorus, like, you know, you're trying to add, you know, a realistic mess up or whatever, there's almost kind of like this disconnect. Even, you know, less extreme examples, like when you're doing, you know, cymbal hits, they're pretty consistent. They drop down a little bit, but if you drop down too much, there's almost like this disconnect. It doesn't sound realistic. Even with like bass guitar, when you're programming MIDI bass guitar, if you drop too low in the velocities from a high velocity, there's this weird disconnect. So you just want to be careful not to overdo this. It's kind of like a fine line with these humanization adjustments. And those are the 5 best tips I can give you for getting more realistic sounding MIDI drums. I think the last thing that I will say, kind of like a bonus tip, listen to well recorded drums. You know, I think of, you know, bands like Slipknot, you know, especially the earlier stuff with Joey Jordison, you'll hear those flams that I was talking about. You know, the drums kind of flam off each other with the timing. You'll hear these little inconsistencies, but it sounds great. So reference stuff like that. Periphery is another good band you could reference to. And really, just your favorite band, as long as, you know, they have actual recorded drums and it's not just a bunch of samples, you know, see if you could get some stems for some of this stuff. You know, I was going to, you know, have a download for my stems. Unfortunately, not quite sure how I do that. So you're kind of on your own for that. If you got any questions about programming drums, leave a comment below. Thank you so much for watching.